The Denver Broncos free agency preview continues with the wide receiver position. Even though the Broncos re-signed Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick to extensions, should they still look at the free agency market? If the Broncos end up trading for a star quarterback, could they include one of their wide receivers in a trade package? What would that look like? And who are some potential free agents that maybe the Broncos might poke around and inquire about at the start of free agency? You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked on NFL Network, your team every day. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. Both of us were privileged enough to cover the Denver Broncos for the Locked on Network and 9 News. Once again, Broncos Country, thank you so much for making Locked on Broncos your first listen today. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast, and you can also watch us on YouTube. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage all year long. Because for the true fan, there's never an offseason. Sayre, my friend, it's been fun doing these free agency previews. We are officially, as it stands today, a month away from free agency. Yesterday, we took a look at the edge rushers for the Broncos and maybe who they should look at. Could Von Miller return? If you didn't get a chance to catch that, Broncos Country, go back and listen. A lot of great insight between Sayre and I going back and forth on different options there. But now our focus is here at wide receiver. And I think the first thing we're going to hear from fans, wide receiver, why would the Broncos focus at wide receiver? Well, you never have enough guys. I mean, the Broncos were tested last year to the point where they were utilizing different guys off practice squad to be able to come in and step into the plate there. So, Sayre, let's break down the position review here in 2021, man. You want to kick us off on what really headlined the Broncos position group?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, Cody, this past year was the war on attrition was real for that Denver Broncos wide receiver group, wasn't it? I mean, obviously, we had Tim Patrick coming back off of a career year, and then Cortland Sutton, obviously, coming back from the ACL injury. And everybody, I think, expected Jerry Jeudy to really take a big leap forward, KJ Hamler as well, to take a big step forward. And of course, like all of the predictions about the wide receiver position were based out of, which quarterback was going to win the starting job. So everybody thought, well, if Teddy Bridgewater wins the starting QB position, Jerry Jeudy stands to benefit greatly from that. And if Drew Lock wins the starting QB position, then Cortland Sutton stands to benefit quite a bit from that. But as it turns out, none of the wide receivers really benefited at all from the decision. So it was a tough year for the receivers. And of course, I think like the most consistent playmaker, I think everybody would probably agree, was Tim Patrick throughout the course of the season. And that's just the reality of the way that things were for the Denver Broncos. I think when I think back to the biggest plays that were made this year, I think about Tim Patrick's plays that he made. So to me, it was a disappointing year, to say the least, at the wide receiver position, Cody. I don't know if you agree with me on that, but man, it was, and I don't think it was necessarily their fault either, no. Right? I think it was the wide receivers were kind of just doing what was asked of them, and they, were getting the targets that they were getting. That's just kind of how it was. It was like they showed up to a restaurant and they're like, well, I didn't necessarily want this kind of food, but here we are. We're going to have to eat whatever gets put in front of us, I guess. So that's kind of how the wide receiver position to me in 2021, that's kind of what it was like. It was just kind of unsatisfying. It was really just left a lot to be desired.
Well, and I think you make a great point there, too. And George Paton did a really great sit-down interview with DenverBroncos.com, Eric Dalala, to talk about this upcoming season and really kind of reflecting on some areas of improvement. And he did mention the wide receiver group. He said the wide receivers didn't have the year that they wanted for themselves. They understand what they have to do to get back to there. But he said we, as an organization, we needed to do a better job of putting them in positions to succeed. And I think when you go back and you have a general manager that's as retrospective and reflective on what could have gone better, and also what did go well, like combining both those things together, you can find a bridge that can kind of marry what you can do going forward that helps you kind of figure out, okay, hey, here's what we can do to put these guys in positions to succeed. George Paton went out in the regular season, Sayre, and you and I had talked about this. Cortland Sutton signed to a contract extension. Tim Patrick signed to a contract extension. Two of their major wide receivers, while Jerry Jeudy's still on a rookie deal here, they locked him up. And the reason why, Sayre, is not because they're like, hey, we don't know what we're going to do at quarterback. These moves happen with certain moves in mind. And I know that we're like I think our ballpark that we talked about before we went on air, 3 weeks, like we're going to find something out about maybe the trajectory of where this team will go based on some other dominoes that will fall around the NFL. Free agency starts in 4 weeks. We'll find out within 3 weeks whether or not, the Broncos will make a heavy run for Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson. But I think these contract extensions were a sign by George Paton saying, hey, we're going all in this upcoming season to get these guys a quarterback that can get them the ball. And I'm excited to see how it happens. But also something impacted Denver this past season, Sarah. Week 1, Jerry Jeudy. I mean, the expectations are really high. He had 6 catches, 72 yards in that first half against the New York Giants. He goes down in that game in what looked like a season-ending injury. Luckily, it only turned out to be a 7 to 8 week injury. He was able to come back in, but he became that motion decoy guy. So he went from being highly utilized in his first action of the season, and you're like, okay, hey, he can be really special in this offense, to all of a sudden, hey, we're just going to motion this guy. We want to distract the defense. We're just going to motion this guy. The most frustrating thing ever. But I think we'd be remiss not to talk about probably one of the bigger impact players that could have maybe had a large impact on the offensive production this season. KJ Hamler goes down in week 3 with an ACL tear. Absolutely brutal. And we saw the preseason that he did have. I mean, he had a couple touchdowns. He had the big one from Drew Lock. He's that downfield threat here. So I think when you have these young guys on the roster that the Broncos currently have at the skill player position, you lock up your big guys on the outside, your third down guys, your red zone targets. I can't help but believe that the Broncos are going all in on quarterback this offseason. So, I think it says something when you have to dip into practice squad guys like David Moore at one point, veteran guys that, were like, hey, this guy could be used in the offense. And guess what? They don't even get used in the offense. So it's like, all right, it is what it is. The offense is what it is for the Denver Broncos. And hopefully Broncos country, the offense can be more productive going into the 2022 NFL season. But coming up here in just a brief moment, both Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we're going to take a look at the Broncos pending free agents, unrestricted free agents, restricted free agents, exclusive rights free agents that are currently on the roster at the wide receiver position. How many are there? Well, there might be 1 or 2 there we'll talk about. And what moves could the Broncos potentially make in terms of looking at some other players? You get that and much more coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. It's our good friends over there, BetOnline.net. And football might be over for this season, but basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this upcoming season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds right to your Olympic coverage and information as well as it's currently ongoing. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action with BetOnline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, sir, taking a look at the free agency market here for the Broncos. We got to look internally first before we look on the outside. And we post some interesting storylines going back and forth from this past season about what the Broncos dealt with at wide receiver, the contract extensions. Does that mean that the Broncos should go out and spend money? I think that's going to be something that's discussed probably. It's going to be debated in our YouTube comment section here. I guarantee you we'll probably get 3 or 4 comments to say, well, why are the Broncos going to do that when they just signed Courtland and Tim? So put that on your bingo card there. I'm going to put that out there. So we'll see how it goes. But the Broncos only have one free agent at the wide receiver position. It's a restricted free agent. It's going to be Davante Spencer, who's been the team's primary kick returner, punt returner for the last couple of years. And, Vic Fangio and Tom McMahon, they loved Davante Spencer. Now you're getting brand new guys in, a new coaching staff. And I feel like it's going to be super hard to be able to see Davante Spencer coming back to Denver. However, there's always a chance. Being a restricted free agent, you get the right of first refusal, but you also have the opportunity to get him at a pretty, decent price. I mean, he's not even going to make barely over $1 million going into 2022. So, Sayre, in your opinion, do you bring back Davante Spencer because he has been that kick returner? I know you and I have had the conversations. He's been really good at catching the ball, but the Broncos need something to where they can progress the ball forward. And unfortunately, that just hasn't happened with Davante in the last couple of seasons.
Right. I mean, at the risk of sounding really greedy here, Cody, there was a point where just catching punts, it was all that we wanted, all that we needed. And that was all that the Broncos really needed to stabilize their terrible special teams. So that was nice to have for a bit. Now I think they do need a bit more of a dynamic presence. And I don't know if everybody else is on page with me on this, but to me, Cody, I didn't notice the same explosiveness with Davante Spencer that we saw last season, where he had that touchdown against the Carolina Panthers late. he just looked more explosive then. I don't know if he was playing injured or what was going on. We didn't hear about anything like that if that was the case. But he just didn't look as explosive. And to me, he left a lot of plays on the table. There was a few punts where, I mean, he was waving for fair catch, and I'm like, dude, you got 15 yards out in front of you. There's nobody there. And I don't know. So maybe there was just something going on. I have no idea what it was, but I think at any rate, as inexpensive as the restricted free agent tender original round for Deontay Spencer would be, and again, that's probably, like you said, going to come in at $1 million or roughly $1 million or less or whatever that would be. I just don't know. I think you let him test the free agent market and you see what other options are available because, like you said, the Broncos did re-sign Tim Patrick. They re-signed Cortland Sutton. Obviously invested the draft capital, even though I think it's worth pointing out, Cody, it was not George Paton who invested that draft capital. So there's no real ties, in my opinion, for George Paton to guys like Jerry Jeudy and KJ Hamler. As gifted and as skilled as they are, you've got a new general manager in there, new faces in the front office, a completely new coaching staff. The slate is wiped clean for these guys. Of course, Cortland Sutton and Tim Patrick are core guys, but I think maybe you do look at internal, maybe KJ Hamler's your return guy. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's somebody else that's not on the team yet. But I think as we get into the discussion about potential free agents, there's possibilities out there that the Broncos can look at to not only upgrade at wide receiver, because we know Deontay Spencer wasn't really contributing there. So you can upgrade out wide receiver and in the return game, I feel like, if you look at some of these guys that are on the free agent market.
And I think that for your returner, you have to be somebody that is consistently within the rotation of your offense or defense, right? Because we see some defensive guys, some speedy DBs and safeties that do play the return position. You have to have some sort of role there just outside of just being a special teams guy. It's different when you talk about kickers and punters because really that's their only job. And they're also responsible for sometimes being able to tackle. So it's like they have a couple responsibilities. Returners have such a dynamic impact on the game. And maybe the Broncos could invest in it. I mean, obviously there's a guy out there, Cordarrelle Patterson, who's set to become a free agent. Could the Broncos look at maybe him? But there's also another angle I do want to touch on here because it's certainly a realistic possibility of free agency coming up. Will Jerry Jeudy be traded if the Broncos do, in fact, trade for a star quarterback, whether it be a Russell Wilson or an Aaron Rodgers? Because more than likely, not only would it acquire draft capital, I mean, in terms of what the Broncos would have to give up, they'd have to give up some young talent as well. And as we know in certain discussions, when the Broncos were on the phone with the Detroit Lions, they wanted Noah Fant, they wanted Jerry Jeudy, they wanted Drew Lock, and George Paton says, no, I'm not doing that. Like, that's too much to give up. But would he be willing at this point? Like you mentioned, he doesn't have an allegiance necessarily to guys like Jerry Jeudy, even though Jerry is one of the most talented guys and has all the potential in the world there. But if you're going out and you have to offset one of your young talents when you already have some guys locked in, do you maybe make that sacrifice while he's still on a rookie deal? That's one of the tough decisions you have to kind of ask yourself in Broncos country. I mean, that's a great question we want to ask you right here, whether you're listening in audio format on your favorite podcast and provider, or if you're watching us here on YouTube, drop it in the comment section or tweet us at Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, what you think the Broncos should do. Would it be worth including Jerry Jeudy into a trade package for a guy like Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers? That's the question right there that we'll pose to you here. I'm eager for your thoughts on this, Sayre.
To me, Cody, I would not hesitate even for 1 second to put him in that deal. And I think that's going to rub a lot of Broncos fans the wrong way. Look, everybody loves the off-season highlight videos of Jerry Jeudy running routes and spinning guys around and putting them in the blender and doing the things that he can do that really you don't see a lot of other guys in the NFL able to do. Like Jerry Jeudy can create separation very easily. But through 2 seasons now, obviously you've got 2 years left on the rookie deal plus the 5th-year team option. So really 3 years of team control plus a franchise tag. So Jerry Jeudy has immense trade value with really 4 years of team control if you count the franchise tag. And that's extremely valuable for a young wide receiver where guys like we've heard Davante Adams maybe asking for $30 million a year. Just imagine what top wide receivers are going to be asking for 3-4 years down the line. So to have 4 years of team control on Jerry Jeudy, he's a very, very valuable trade piece. To me, he's at a really interesting fork in the road at his NFL career. Through 2 seasons, we've heard quite a bit of, frankly, complaining from Jerry Jeudy, haven't we? I mean, he's deleting social media posts and he's talking about getting his conditioning in. And that kind of stuff, it doesn't really sit well with me, Cody. You see Cortland Sutton. I mean, Cortland Sutton is one of the best guys in the entire league, in my
Yeah.
opinion, at celebrating his other teammates' success. That's part of why he's a core guy on this team. Jerry Jeudy, I think, he's come from Alabama and he was the superstar in high school. He was the number one receiver on those teams. Now having to play kind of a wide receiver 3 type of role, you can't help but wonder from the outside looking in, how well does that really sit with Jerry Jeudy? And so to me, I think if you bring a quarterback in like Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson, if a team's like, we're not trading him to you unless you give us Jerry Jeudy, I would say, you know what? That's fine. We'll do that trade. Ideally, though, I'd say you would want to have Jerry there, because with the guys that you have on the outside, Tim Patrick, Cortland Sutton, and Jerry Jeudy in the slot with KJ Hamler as kind of just a dynamic option off the sideline, I feel like that's really the ideal setup for you in terms of getting the best out of all these guys. But if it came down to it, I would be okay, I think, parting with Jerry Jeudy in order to get a superstar quarterback, because you're still putting yourself in a championship window even without Jeudy.
I think you made some really solidified concrete points there, because it's tough to give up on a young guy. It's tough to have to give up a guy that you drafted with first round potential. That, there was an argument he could have been the best wide receiver in that class. I mean, obviously there's the whole thing where we look at Justin Jefferson's production with the Minnesota Vikings, and that's who George Paton and the Vikings ended up going with. You always have to kind of wonder where they would have stand. Let's say Jerry Jeudy was available. Would the Vikings under George Paton and Rick Spielman, would they have gone with the Jerry Jeudy? But you are right. You do have to, if you want to acquire something great, you're going to have to give up something great. And Jerry Jeudy does have that potential. And the great point that you made too about the potential rise in what contracts wide receivers will look for eventually, as the NFL salary cap is expected to rise and rise and rise over the next 3 to 4 years to areas we've never seen before when it comes to professional football. I mean, other sports is different, because other sports, some of them don't have salary cap issues. So I think that's a tremendous point that you make. But also, you could include Jerry Jeudy because he's a former first round pick. If you do include him in a trade, maybe you can swap first round picks with another team. Let's say you swap with a Seattle. Let's say you swap with a Green Bay and they get yours and you get theirs, but they get a first round player as well. It does have some sense in terms of like the backing, draft capital. So you don't necessarily have to give up all your capital in a sense, like you're going to give up some, but you do get some capital back in return. So I think that kind of weighs it to where I agree with you. If that is the case, and I would say, yes, I'm all for that. Broncos Country, what are your thoughts about this situation? Let us know in the YouTube comments or tweet us at Roark NFL, at Lockdown Broncos, at Sayre Bedinger. We can't wait to interact and respond to the tweets that you have sent forth to us and the comments here on YouTube. But coming up here in just a moment, Sayre and I, we're going to take a look at some free agent options that are set to become unrestricted free agents here this upcoming season. And maybe the Broncos should poke around a little bit, especially if they do, in fact, include Jerry Jeudy in a trade option. They have to look to sign somebody else, especially with the salary cap estimations that they have. We'll get to that coming up here in just a moment. But real quick, before we get to that, I just want to tell you that Locked On Podcast Network, we have a lot of great things in store for you. We have the NFL Free Agency Frenzy. You're going to get courtesy of Sayre Bedinger, myself, the other local experts covering their team. So anytime that there is a free agency signing, you can expect that if the Broncos sign somebody from the Saints, you're going to hear from Ross Jackson, as well as he's going to give us the lowdown on who the Broncos are getting, and vice versa. The Locked On Podcast Network is one of the top podcast networks in the entire world, taking over the sports world, your team every day. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. Once again, Broncos Country, thank you so much for making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Both Sayre Bedinger and myself, we appreciate you and your interaction and your Broncos discussions here on YouTube or on Twitter, social media, your favorite podcast provider. We're so grateful for you. But Sayre, continuing on with the theme of today's show, our Denver Broncos free agency preview, looking at wide receiver or some potential free agent players that we'd like to sign. I think when we look at some of the top names, right, Denver's going to have, I think, around an estimated $50 million in salary cap space available. If they do restructure some deals, which could happen, we saw the Broncos do that last year, restructure some deals to get a little bit more. We could see that before free agency. It could rise up for the Broncos. They're sitting in a really good spot here financially. I was taking a look at the free agency list from some other teams. One name stood out to me, Allen Robinson. But then again, I started thinking to myself, with the Broncos paying Courtland, with them paying Tim, some of these top dollar guys probably aren't going to be feasible. So it's more like a pipe dream, especially when you consider Allen Robinson's talent. He is not going to settle for less. So I guess I could cross Robinson off the list there. Chris Godwin, I can cross off the list. Coming off ACL surgery, no Tom Brady in Tampa Bay, could be a franchise tag candidate. Probably out of the asking price here for the Broncos unless he's willing to take a pay cut. But the one intriguing option, though, that has been discussed, it's been floated up by many people, Davante Adams potentially via trade. And we talked about Jerry Jeudy being included in that. The Broncos could get a 2-for-1 here in Green Bay.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's really the like if we were general managers working a Madden franchise right now, that's the number one pick right there. If you could get Rodgers and Davante Adams to come to Denver, especially if that means keeping Sutton and Patrick, I mean, man, that is right there. That's I don't know how you're stopping that, That's just tough. But I think it's pretty obvious right now. You need to have three really, really good wide receivers in the NFL, at least, right? Because
Yeah.
look at the Los Angeles Rams. I mean, they lose Robert Woods. They immediately they get pretty lucky, and Odell Beckham Jr. becomes available, and they're able to kind of just replace that productivity in their offense. Look at the Cincinnati Bengals. Obviously, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd. I mean, that's one of the best trios in the league. So the Denver Broncos, I think, need to kind of follow what's going on all around the league. These teams, they're building these wide receiver war chests, and I think you have to do that. It's such an important position in today's NFL, especially having just a dynamic and versatile group. So to me, it wouldn't be overkill if you're talking about that's what a lot of people I think are going to say or think is that, well, if you trade for Rodgers, you don't need to get Davante Adams because you already have blah blah blah. It doesn't matter. I mean, you've got to have big time playmakers, and just think about what Davante Adams could unlock for people like Cortland Sutton, for people like Tim Patrick, Noah Fant. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. You add a guy like that. Just the exhibit A is Jamar Chase in Cincinnati. T. Higgins was solid his first year in the league. Tyler Boyd was a really good slot receiver, but you add Jamar Chase to that mix, all of a sudden those guys are getting a lot more one-on-one matchups, and their skill sets are able to be enhanced, highlighted, you name it. You pick the word there. So I like that idea, Cody, but I think you're right. I think the more likely situation is the Broncos going for, I don't know, not necessarily reclamation projects, but maybe kind of like, hey, let's take a 1 or 2 year deal on this guy who's been really productive in the past, maybe struggled with injury, maybe struggled with inconsistency. I think you named some really good guys on your list. Like Will Fuller is a very fascinating name to include on there because obviously he has big time speed, struggles to stay healthy.
Yeah.
But when he's healthy, I mean, he's like a touchdown every like 4 or 5 receptions, it feels like. So I feel like he's a strong option. So any other options that really stand out to you on this free agent list?
Well, Jamison Crowder from the New York Jets, I mean, he's kind of been a thorn in the side of many opposing DBs. I mean, he does have that speed, right? So, he's not necessarily a top name guy in the National Football League. He's kind of that middle tier, and he'll be a consistent guy for you. And I think, as you mentioned, with the guys like Courtland and Tim and Noah, the size that they have, Crowder could be a guy that really has success, especially across the middle of the field or even on out routes. I mean, you can go vertical with him sometimes, but that's really what you're going to try to use KJ Hamler for, is for those types of plays. Jamison Crowder could be a reliable guy, especially on third down here for the Broncos. I was thinking about Juju Smith-Schuster. Who knows where he's going? I know that he's gotten some reputation stuff because people didn't like the fact that he is so focused on TikTok and doing all the dancing on logos before games, and people didn't like that, and then the Bengals blew him up for it. But he's a reliable guy too. He's a really good blocker, which is super, super important, especially in what the Broncos offense is going to have coming forward. The wide receivers are going to have to block their tail off, probably more so than they ever have. I think because it's going to really open things up for them outside of that. I was thinking about Mike Williams. That was like a pipe dream. Could you just imagine Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Mike Williams? You right there, you have 3 of the potential best possession wide receivers in the NFL with size. That's not going to happen. He'll likely be franchise tagged and extended. LA is not going to let him go. That's a pipe dream there. But maybe some under the radar guys like Rashard Higgins. Obviously, who played football at Colorado State University, set to become an unrestricted free agent from Cleveland. Those are some names I'm looking at, Sayre, but there's some other names out there too that you listed on here that do have some ties to maybe Nathaniel Hackett and some ties here to the Broncos organization.
Absolutely. I mean, DJ Chark coming off of injury, I feel like that's a name to keep an eye on. I'm sure he'll go for a team or situation where, they're going to feature him more in their offense, but I think that's a name to watch out for in terms of, I don't know how George Paton is necessarily going to operate in year 2. We didn't see like a ton of, hey, here's a reclamation project type of thing, or here we're going to take a risk on this injured player in free agency. It was really more targeted towards like, we're going to help Vic Fangio get the best opportunity to succeed this year and target those type of players. So I'm intrigued to see how he'll work with a new coaching staff. But obviously DJ Chark started off his career in Jacksonville. He's been very productive when healthy, so I like that option. Isaiah McKenzie is a free agent, Cody. It feels like he's been with the Buffalo Bills for a long time now, since he was supposed to bring the juice to the Denver Broncos. But
Yep.
man, if the coaching staff was really the only hang up for him in Denver, he kind of fits what we talked about in the previous segment about maybe a return guy.
Boom. Yeah.
And I mean, just a gadget player on the offense, been very productive for them. So he's in a really good spot, honestly. So I don't know if he'll leave Buffalo, but at the same time, money talks. So. And there's another former Bronco on the list that I think, obviously, we played against this year. He had some success against our defense. I don't know. What do you think about Khalif Raymond, Cody, making a comeback to the Mile High City?
Yeah, that would be an interesting one too, because I think when we think about Raymond, what type of role would he have within this offense at wide receiver, right? I feel like maybe a Raymond would be sort of similar to like a Deontay Spencer situation, but I just don't see Raymond as being that return guy. However, with Isaiah McKenzie, like you mentioned, return option right there, kick return, punt return easily. And he had some explosive returns this season. I mean, he really provided a dynamic that really set the Buffalo Bills and their really good offense that they had in great field position, which the Broncos' average starting field position last year was one of the bottom 10 in the NFL. So you having a guy that can get you different field position, I think, is one thing. And also I think growth too for Isaiah McKenzie. He's found that in Buffalo. So I don't know if they're going to look at bringing him back, but Raymond would be like the more questionable one of those two. What role would he have in the offense, right? Because he kind of has a similar Deontay Spencer vibe to him there, but I don't think he necessarily returns. So, I think it depends. Do the Broncos want to beef up and add depth that can contribute, or do they want to just have enough depth just in case like guys go down with injury? Because look, the NFL will look eventually, Sayre, to adding an additional regular season game, which I think is the worst idea. I get the NFL loves money, but in terms of player safety and the way that these guys' bodies feel after like week 7, I just don't think it's a good idea. Players I've spoken to about it, they're like, I hope not. I hope they don't do that because that's going to suck in terms of like body recovery. And then not to mention you add an additional regular season game that they already did on top of the playoff slate that you already have. If you make it to the playoffs, that's just a lot of football games to be played in that short amount of time. So it's kind of how I feel about that. But I like the option too about DJ Chark that you mentioned, especially coming off injury. Do you want to take a chance on a guy like that? I think that for where he was at in Jacksonville, not utilized in a way I think that kind of produces well for him. Same thing with Laviska Shenault, and maybe that changes under Doug Peterson. We'll have to see there, though. But a lot of great options that you've thrown out here today. Sayre Bedinger with the heat, as always. Broncos Country, we appreciate you for tuning in to Lockdown Broncos today. That will wrap up today's episode of the show. Our Denver Broncos free agency preview continues going into tomorrow's episode of the show. Sayre and I, we're going to take a look at the Broncos' interior defensive linemen that could be free agents, not to mention some potential free agent options, particularly at the nose tackle position, a very important need for Denver this upcoming offseason. We get to that on tomorrow's episode. Lockdown Broncos. Once again, thank you so much for listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform. Thank you for watching us on YouTube. We appreciate you so much for making us your first listen of the day. Well, Sayre Bedinger and myself, we will be back tomorrow for a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.